Let me reveal my declining age by swinging back to the late 1980s, when I was a sprightly law student in the UK. One summer, I flew back to Jordan, crossed the Alembi Bridge, and headed by taxi to Jerusalem via Jericho in order to spend my summer vacation with family. That summer stood out for me. Why? Well, for one, I decided to go to an ulpan in order to learn Hebrew. Now, for those of you who hadn't heard this word, an ulpan is an institute for the intensive study of the Hebrew language. The word means teaching or instruction. 3 months of intensive Hebrew in a group of 10 other students for 5 days a week was a marker for me. I learned the language fairly easily, did all my exercises furiously, joined a chat group to practice what I was learning, and realized firsthand that Hebrew and Arabic, both Semitic languages, aren't hugely different in some of their roots. This step helped me in future summer courses too, and it stood me in great stead in my Oslo-related second-track negotiations well over a decade later. One of the other students in the class was an Australian woman who'd also decided to study Hebrew. We both were linguophiles, but I guess her reasons for studying Hebrew were different from mine. And unlike me, who lived in occupied East Jerusalem, she was staying with a Jewish Ashkenazi, otherwise broadly speaking European family, in a neighborhood of West Jerusalem within Israel. Well, hormones, coupled with a strong affinity for each other, let alone a mutual liking of beef stroganoff with the glass of Anjou rosé wine, we became, after a few dates, an item for the duration of my summer break. In fact, we were an item for a while longer, because she then joined me in England for a year before returning to Oz, as many Australians with a wanderlust do at least once during their lifetimes. But her being in a house in West Jerusalem meant that I had to visit her there, just as she came to my house in East Jerusalem and met with my family too. So this is how I met Phyllis and Moshe, as well as their daughter who was serving in the Israeli army. And guess what? This was just pre the first intifada in the occupied Palestinian territories. So the political realities were pretty much tense already. Yet, I never once balked at the idea of spending time with the family she was staying with, a British Jewish mother, a German Jewish father, and a native Israel-born daughter. Add an Australian and an Armenian to this motley group, and you had the beginnings of another UN forum. To this day, I vividly recall their Erev Shabbat Friday meals and our discussions about the occupation of Palestinian lands by Israel in 1967. I must admit here, though, that we never breached the topic of 1948. They knew my political views quite well, and yet we had these discussions, sometimes with the daughter joining us too. I don't think we agreed with each other's viewpoints most of the time, but there was an ability, call it dexterity or diplomacy, to talk and even argue about the issues, sometimes quite tensely, but still. And let me say here that my case might have been somewhat different from the general rule. If I were an Arab and not an Armenian, if I were not dating a woman staying with them, or even if I hadn't grown up in France and was therefore a tad more removed from the numbing pain of the occupation, things might have well been different. They mightn't have been welcoming, and I mightn't have been comfortable. So I understand that my story might be special. But hey, guess what? We're all special with our stories. So, dear viewers, ask me now, Harry, this is indeed very nice. But why in the dickens should we be interested in your personal story some 4 decades ago? Well, it's your right to exclaim, of course, but let me tell you why it matters here and now. If I fast forward the mid-1980s to the early 2020s, would I have been able to do the same socializing and hold the same conversations as I did then with this Jewish family? My answer is an unyielding no. And I say this not only as an Armenian who has espoused the Palestinian culture and has advocated for Palestinian self-determination for long decades. I say this because the Israeli Jewish society, largely via the influence and action of its politicians and stakeholders, has shifted massively. Not only have there been demographic changes and political reorientations, but the Israel of the post-Holocaust era has morphed into the Israel of post-Nakba and then of post-occupation. It is now a more strident and vitriolic state that happily tramples over the human rights and dignity of any Palestinian, Christian or Muslim, young or old. The victim of history has become, since 1967, slowly but surely, the victimizer. This has been happening over long decades, mind you, but it has attained its apogee of crassness with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and more pointedly, with the Netanyahu of today, who has wedded himself to a bunch of brutal religious settlers as ministers, whose only aim is to annex the whole of the Palestinian lands to their biblical dream of Judea and Samaria, and who wish to have all Palestinians transferred out of their lands to other countries, even if this meant killing quite a few in the process. To my mind, these men and women serving in the Israeli government today aren't ministers or spokespersons. Rather, they are criminal thugs. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is going along with them in this direction because, one, he agrees with it, like father, like son, I'd add, and two, because they keep him out of jail. The sad thing is that we in the West, the USA, the European Union, the UK, and even quite a few Arab countries are silent about it. We even tolerate it by propagating the misconception that Israel is a democracy, the only democracy in the region. Perish the thought that we adopt the term apartheid when it comes to Israel, as we did so readily with South Africa. Perish the thought that we apply sanctions against Israel in the way we did in South Africa. Perish the thought that we support the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, even if only for products and services in mushrooming settlements. Perish the thought that we dare write an article or utter a statement that criticizes not Jews, but Israeli occupation policies, whereby we'd immediately and falsely, in my opinion, get labeled as anti-Semites. This is not merely tawdry populism, not also merely craven hypocrisy. It is denial politics. We in the West are still gripped by a colonial mentality, and what we in Europe no longer colonize today, we do it indirectly via Israeli bilious policies. A colonialism that kills, maims, appropriates, steals, imprisons, expels, annexes, demolishes, and ostracizes ordinary Palestinian men, women, and children without any pang of conscience. And the painful bit is to see some of our democratic leaders also come out with sanctimonious statements, while some Arab countries also do the business and look the other way. Palestinians are no longer viewed by many as a people with a cause. They've become a transaction, and they are simply an impediment to malefic Israel-managed political designs. This was not the case in the 1980s. Some of you might differ with me, but I stand my ground on this. It was not the same in the 1980s. Today, a more sinister approach to interest-based politics has taken hold of our world. And politicians like Netanyahu, mind you, many others too, but they aren't usually occupying another people, are milking it to the very last drop. And this is precisely why I wouldn't be able to go and have discussions with the Jewish family where my partner was staying for her summer break. Words and discussions are sadly no longer able to separate truth from falsehood or hope from despair. This is why I contrast yesterday with today, and why I'm filled with doom-laden grief and foreboding, because it'll take quite a while for the dial to swing back. And frankly, I don't think I'll see it either. Yesterday was bad for Palestinians, but today is decidedly worse. Let me conclude this episode with Mahmoud Darwish, Palestinian icon and poet. In 2007, he told a journalist, and I quote, "The Palestinians are the only nation in the world that feels with certainty that today is better than what the days ahead will hold." End of quote. Isn't this a cynical look at the future from a poet who wrote so much about hope? Or is it a realistic one? But you know what? I still hope. Call me the eternal, hopeful, naive person. I don't know. But I do hope that his cynicism yesterday and my cynicism today will both be proven wrong.